You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with Guardian columnist Zoe Williams and the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the breaking news that Levelling Up Housing and Communities Secretary Michael Gove is standing down at the general election is top story in the Financial Times, which says more Tory MPs have quit this time than before the big defeat by Labour in 1997. That number of MPs quitting is also lead item on tomorrow's front page. The Times says the news will only add to the pre-election pressure already building for Rishi Sunak. The Express describes it as shock news that has rocked the Conservatives. The Mirror reacts bluntly. Now Gove quits Sunak's sinking ship. Labour's Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves has been speaking to the Mail, promising its readers that if she comes to power, she won't play fast and loose with their money. While Chancellor Jeremy Hunt tells The Telegraph he's going to help the middle classes with tax breaks. The International Court of Justice order to Israel to stop attacking the city of Rafa in Gaza is top story in Zoe's paper, The Guardian. And finally, The Star says scientists have found a cure for men who snore. It's learning to play the didgeridoo. They didn't mention the word boffin, though. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Zoe Williams and Henry Hill. Welcome to both of you. So let's start with what was the breaking news not so long ago, and that is the decision by Michael Gove not to stand to leave the Conservative Party as an MP. Zoe.
I mean, Michael Gove must have had so many disappointments over the past 8 years that it's kind of uncountable, really. It's not that long ago that he thought he could lead the party and then decided that he was too unpopular as a human being. It's not that long ago that he thought his people were on the ascendance and then they no longer were. It's just not that long ago that he thought being Levelling Up Secretary was going to make a real difference in the Levelling Up scenario and just didn't realise that it wasn't, because it wasn't a real plan. So I'm kind of surprised in a way that he's lasted this long. But I'm also fascinated to hear your view on whether he knew. Do you think he knew that
we're going to bring Henry in at the moment, so there's a little problem with your microphone, which we're going to sort out. So, Henry, yes, give us your view.
I think from his perspective, being the Conservative Party almost certainly is going to lose this election heavily, and then they'll have, presumably, probably at least 2 terms in opposition. He has been in Parliament since 2005. He has served in a string of senior government roles. It makes sense to move on, in a sense, because it's increasingly rare for MPs to treat being in Parliament as the lifetime vocation that it was maybe a generation or 2 ago, when you had lots of people simply dying in office and precipitating a by-election in the sort of euphemism of the time. The average length of a parliamentary career now is 3 terms in office. So I can understand it. It's a lot of MPs seem to have sort of come to this decision very quickly after the announcement of the snap election. He hadn't trailed this previously. I don't think there'd been any previous indication that he was going to stand down. But from his perspective, do you want to be, as someone who's been a senior cabinet minister, do you want to be on the front bench, on the opposite side, staring at a new Labour government for 5 years? Maybe he can think of better things to do with his time.
But the thing I was going to ask you before my mic stopped working,
right.
Do you think he knew that the election was going to be called?
No, I don't.
It's really funny.
No one, as far as I can tell. Wow. No one outside the Downing Street team. Because also, if Gove knew, we'd have known.
Yeah,
with the best will in the world, the press would have found out if anything had got to Michael.
But when do you think the decision was taken then?
So the official timeline, which has been reported in some of the newspapers, is that this has been in the works for about 2 months, which makes sense because the budget was definitely not a pre-election budget. When they did that, they were clearly planning on having another fiscal event, which they could do more targeted sort of giveaways. But by April 25th, they did that big defence spending announcement. Now, they had taken a lot of flack for not including defence in the budget. And that only made sense if they were going to hold defence for the autumn statement and spring Labour a bung of cash for the troops that they'd have to deal with. So leaking that out suggested they decided to go for an election. But I've also heard rumours that it was a decision made in the last few days. That obviously could just be scuttlebutt, I don't know. But those are the two timelines. Officially, 2 months or so. Unofficially, a few days.
So let's return to Michael Gove. Just wanted to read a little bit from his resignation letter, in which he says, I also know the toll office can take, as do those closest to me. No one in politics is a conscript. We are volunteers who willingly choose our fate, and the chance to serve is wonderful, but there comes a moment when you know that it is time to leave, that a new generation should leave.
Well, I mean, separate to all the disappointments that he has had, he's also in a very different party to the party he joined, right? I mean, you know, as he was on the ascendant, it was a Cameroonian era. It was very... Obviously, he was the Times journalist originally. It was very Timesy. It was very centrist. It was very kind of... You know, it certainly claimed not to be radical, even though its acts were quite radical. And it spoke a language that he understood. Even though he adapted, I'm not sure that he was ever that happy to adapt. And as the party became more sort of vehement post-Brexit, he never seemed that happy with the vehemence, I didn't think.
Also in the FT, the Express, the I, the Times. Henry, I wonder if you could speak to the timing. Do you think that it's deliberately destructive in terms of what it says as to what Michael Gove thinks of Rishi Sunak?
Well, the timing of his resignation.
I mean, he couldn't have gone any later, right?
Well, yeah, I suppose on the one level, he sneaked it out on a Friday evening. You know,
hoping we wouldn't notice.
No. But like, you know, I mean, frankly, the Tory campaign has generated so many exciting stories already that maybe that was his hope. But yeah, he had to resign at some point between the dissolution of Parliament and the election being called, which isn't a very long window anyway. And I suspect that the driving force, maybe there was some 4D chess, I want to hurt Rishi Sunak, but also his constituency has to choose a new MP. And the Conservative Party has to select, I think, around 150 candidates for seats that it hasn't, because Rishi Sunak didn't even tell his own party. The Conservatives have not been secretly preparing for an election for 2 months. CCHQ is as surprised as anyone. And he would have had to tell his association, I am not going to stand, because they will have asked him. And once he's told them that, it's going to come out. So it might be that there's some secret plan or reasoning there, but I suspect it was just he had to tell someone because his constituency needed to know.
How can it be 150 candidates that they need to find, PPCs, I mean? Because they've only got 77 resignations.
Just seats they haven't selected candidates for. Because that includes, like, Labour-held seats.
It's up to 78
and they
now,
do
isn't
at
it?
least need to put a candidate up in them.
Do they?
For the show, just for the look of the thing.
We need to mention Andrea Leadsom as well, because that might have been too late for some of the papers. But that resignation letter, quite different to Michael Gove's, only mentioned Rishi Sunak in the address, Dear Prime Minister Rishi, and she says that she still wants to work for the Conservative Party, but not for Rishi Sunak. Do you think that's much more damning? And also we know that she was inquiring, asking about putting a letter of no confidence.
Well, I mean, she's been quite mischievous, I would say, ever since she stood for leader and stood down. She's sort of been in the mischief wing of the party. Would you say that was fair? I mean, I was just remembering.
Mischief wing.
Yeah, I mean, we were just remembering the leadership election where she stood against Theresa May and then didn't, and everybody said they looked like the same woman, dead and alive. And Andrea Leadsom was always extremely zealous. And I think probably she's not done yet, in a way that Gove kind of... I can't see him making a comeback into mainstream politics, whereas I can see Leadsom going for it in some other iteration.
Interesting. Let's move on to the Mail and Rachel Reeves, the headline there, I'll never play fast and loose with your money. That is her promise, should she get into power.
Yeah, so Labour is basically on Project Reassurance. This has been Starmer's whole strategy, is that the Conservatives have shed a lot of voters. Those voters are often not natural Labour voters. They're often in the so-called Blue Wall, which are sort of more prosperous seats in the east of England, south-east of England. And Labour's job, given how far ahead they are in the polls, is basically not to do anything to mess that up, and that means reassuring those voters that Labour is a safe bet, which is why, as we've seen over the last couple of months since the budget, given the state of the polls and some of the major policy challenges the next government is going to face, Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves have not been that far apart on most tax and spend policy. So this is all part of that. There's even the sort of very Jeremy Huntish hint that she would like to eventually cut taxes for working people, which I'm sure people are delighted to hear. But the truth is, whoever forms the next government, it's going to be an absolutely horrifying fiscal situation for them. There are sort of more than £20 billion worth of unfunded spending cuts that have been earmarked for the 25-26 fiscal year to create fiscal headroom in the budget. She's not going to have much room to go on a big spending spree, even if she wanted to, but she's just trying to reassure voters that Labour aren't about to hike taxes up.
Just because of time, let's move on to the Telegraph, because Jeremy Hunt is speaking about inheritance tax, and he's vowed to support the middle classes with tax breaks.
It's so ridiculous, this conversation. It irritates me so much. Only 5% of the country pays inheritance tax. So to frame this as an issue facing the middle classes is absurd. And it's kind of periodically, I see it as a policy as ridiculous as the stopping young people ever from smoking policy. You know, you can, in your own head, turn it into an interesting conversation, but on the page, it's ridiculous. Nobody has that much money anymore.
Exercised about it, even though it
probably doesn't. Do they? Or is it just Telegraph columnists?
No, genuinely, the weird thing about that is that despite how few people pay it, inheritance tax is the second least popular tax in the country. People genuinely hate it.
Well, OK,
even if they're not going to pay
the job of a responsible media, then, is to say, lighten up, you guys, you're not going to pay it anyway, rather than just whipping it up into this nonsense.
Right.
Well, they do detail who is liable to the inheritance tax, so that the figures are there. People need to read them.
I think there should be a more mature attitude.
I'm going to stop you there because we're running out of time. Zoe and Henry, we can continue talking after the break. Do stay with us. Coming up on the front of The Guardian, the UN's top court has told Israel to stop its offensive in the southern Gazan city of Rafa.
It's really interesting because what they've been able to do is sort of stabilise living breast tissue in the lab for about a week. And what that means is that we can see directly the impact of new drugs and new therapies, how they would respond in the human body, as opposed to just in cells or in our closest animal relatives or anything like that. So this has the potential to really individualise and change treatment for women and men if they get breast cancer as it progresses. But this is very, very early stage. So more and more people are getting breast cancer. The mortality is dropping, so more and more people are living for longer with it or are surviving it. So what we need to do now, after this piece of research, is actually work out how we use the drugs on this tissue and see what happens next. Because when you look at human tissue as a whole, there are whole loads of things that go into it. The blood supply, the immune response, even just sort of the matrix that it lives in. And that's how we will begin to be able to tell the difference between why do some drugs work in some people and not in others? And when we can individualise care, that's when we will get the better responses. When you see these stories in the newspaper, you think, oh, how is this going to help me tomorrow? How is it going to help my loved one tomorrow? And unfortunately, we are quite a long way from that. But anything that gives us hope when we know that cancer incidence is rising is hugely important. We know that some cases of breast cancer will be related actually to alcohol. There's no safe amount of alcohol that you can have to reduce your risk of breast cancer. The more you drink, the increase your risk is. But what this research was showing, that over 10,000 people died of alcohol-specific related deaths in 2022. And that was the highest amount that has ever been recorded. And by that, I mean specifically liver related to alcohol, or perhaps another thing that was specifically related to that alcohol, as opposed to alcohol increasing your risk of cancer or alcohol increasing your risk of heart disease. And this is really important because we need to look at how do we prevent this alcohol-induced harm. In Wales and in Scotland, they have a minimum pricing per unit of alcohol, which may make a difference. But actually, what is the funding and treatment availabilities for people with drug and alcohol-related harm?
Can take that if you want.
Okay, yeah.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. Let's take a look at the Morning Star. Not a paper we normally peruse, but they're saying that Jeremy Corbyn, running as an independent, is going to be a big headache for Sir Keir Starmer. Do you agree, Zoe?
I don't think it's a huge headache for Keir because he was never going to not stand, and I don't think Keir Starmer was ever going to let him stand as a Labour MP. So this will have been priced in. I mean, it's nothing like when Ken Livingstone stood as an independent because Blair wouldn't let him stand as a Labour mayor. That was a real seismic event, and it did change the kind of internal balance of the Labour Party. It changed the kind of function of the London mayor. It changed everything. Whereas this is, I believe, exactly what everybody thought was going to happen. I would be surprised if he didn't win. He's an immensely popular local MP. There's nobody I mean, if I lived in Islington North and I'm a Labour member. But, you know, if I had an MP who'd been there my entire life, I would probably vote. I don't want to get kicked out of the Labour Party.
But you don't say any more.
I'm not going to say
too much. You said too much.
I would be surprised. And I think the smart thing for Labour to do is just not to be too embarrassed about it, just to say that's it, que sera, sera.
Henry, do you think it won't cause too much of an issue?
No, I think because it's the same as when we have Labour having problem in specific seats over Gaza or with George Galloway, right? Like, it may be in specific seats, this one, for example, but look how far Labour are ahead in the polls. And the probable size of a Labour majority, even if there is quite a range, it's not going to be one. So losing one seat in an inner city in an election where you win a landslide, it's probably fine. And you think about elections previously when you had independents in, like, the 2005 Parliament, George Galloway picking up Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005. Did that shake Tony Blair to his foundations? No, I don't think it didn't.
I think as well, you know, there was something quite frustrating about Corbyn when he was the leader of the Labour Party and he would stand up and say, I'm going to stand for peace and socialism. And you're like, OK, dude, but can you also do something about the Brexit, for example? And now that he wouldn't have any actionable agenda, there's something very endearing about standing for peace and socialism.
Sort of self-confessed hobbyist stuff.
Well, yeah.
Let's move to The Guardian, your paper, Zoe, and looking at this ICJ ruling that ordering Israel to halt its assault in the southern Gazan city of Rafa. This is the furthest that they've gone. This is the third pronouncement, but the strongest as of yet. Henry?
Oh, I thought you were yeah. So I thought you were going to go to Zoe first. Yeah, they've sorry. This is slightly. It's sort of like the theatre of international law in a way, because it's a court judgment, and normally we expect a court judgment and we think it's some kind of binding framework of law, but it's not. And Israel has indicated that it has absolutely no intention of abiding by this judgment. So in terms of actually influencing Israeli policy in Gaza, and specifically with the Rafah offensive, it says at the end of this article, it still remains the case that Israel's major allies, the United Kingdom, the United States and others, would have to bring force to bear. But I think that something like this judgment, it Israel's problem is that the movement of international opinion against it, it's slow. Israel has a lot of goodwill, but it could be permanent. And Israel is not a country that can afford to be isolated from international opinion in the long term.
So we've got about 20 seconds.
I mean, what's so frustrating about it is that it says Israel's increasingly isolated and this will put more pressure on them. But really what's at stake is the international order. You know, if repeated court judgments can say this is unacceptable and it carries on anyway, then the peacekeeping framework of the world is at stake. And, you know, I think it's much bigger than...
Zoe, we must leave it there because of time. Thank you both. You can say much more in the 11 o'clock hour. In the meantime, let's catch up with the weather for you. Well, the UK's bank holiday weekend will be rather unsettled, but tomorrow will be fine for many. Most places will have a dry start, have a little chilly in places, but there'll be some fog patches around. They'll lift to leave plenty of morning sunshine, but cloud will bubble up to give a few showers. Meanwhile, thicker cloud and rain will move into South West Island and parts of eastern England by lunchtime. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, Michael Gove and Andrea Leadsom are the latest high-profile MPs to announce they won't be seeking re-election.